Elden Ring has gone on to become the best-selling game not only by From Software, but by Bandai Namco in general. Many new and old to the Soulsborne franchise have given it critical acclaim all around. But now that a whole year has gone by and the honeymoon phase has passed, how does Elden Ring hold up? With the build variety and how open the game is, follow-up playthroughs can give a whole new perspective to the game, so I'd like to explore that in this video as well. Of course, this answer will vary for everyone, but I'll be giving my take on this question, as well as my hopes and predictions for the inevitable DLC. I'll also be redoing my rankings for most of the bosses as we go along, as my opinion for a lot of them have definitely changed. So let us explore the lands between once more, with a reflective look back on how this game feels after the initial hype has fizzled out. For the background footage, I'll be creating a PvP character I call the Executioner, so based on that theme, have fun figuring out what the equipment is gonna be. So right away, let's start with the first boss, the Grafted Scion. For a boss you're not really supposed to be able to beat, I suppose it's fine, but it's certainly quite brutal how you have no healing items at the beginning. All the previous unbeatable bosses in the FromSoft games have at least given you the option to heal by this point. I ran a Twitter poll at one point to ask people if they've actually beaten this in the first encounter, and I don't know, I'm a little inclined to doubt this personally, unless people have actively reset trying to beat it for the first time. I certainly have never beat this, but I haven't tried too hard either, and definitely haven't reset, I just can't be bothered. I suppose if I ever want their weapons, I probably will try to reset and get them, but it's gonna be a pain in the butt, that's for sure. I'll give this one a B tier. Cool design, a little awkward to fight, but not too bad. After this, you have the choice to go into the Cave of Knowledge, or just going straight into the game proper. Of course, the Cave of Knowledge being the proper tutorial area. As a very old school Souls fan, I was very happy with how they decided to have the proper tutorial area off to the side, missable and skippable, rewarding exploration right off the bat. Of course, eventually they added a tutorial prompt that tells you about it, and at first I was like, really? But after some thought, I feel like this is probably important enough for the first time players that it's a good enough compromise as they could make. I will say though, the fact that it's a drop like it is definitely not ideal. Even veteran Soul players have a hard time telling what is and isn't a lethal fall in these games, so maybe they should have thought about that a little bit more, even if there is a ledge that's a little bit more accessible. Limgrave in its entirety is a pretty good starting area overall. It allows more freedom to go outside of it than say the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild, but it still has a lot it can teach you. If you happen to go all the way to Caelid, I think the sky turning red is a fair indicator that you're about to enter a not so great area that you're likely not ready for, and if somehow that didn't deter you, the giant dogs in the distance likely will. The only thing that, while cool in its own right, baffles me a little bit, is the trap chest that takes you deep into Caelid. Totally not speaking from experience or anything. You can't even warp out of here unless you get out of the cave. This is a great chest and repeat playthroughs if you want to rush into Caelid to get something, but geez. The path down to Shifa River is surely ingrained into most players' minds. It's one of the most memorable parts of the game, but I won't fully discuss the area until later. Let's wrap around back to the first step and talk about the Tree Sentinel. I have mixed feelings about this one. It's certainly a good way to teach you early that if you're struggling with something early on, you have no reason not to go elsewhere and explore. There's attractions pretty much everywhere, so you can always pick a place to go to and see that instead. However, the fight itself is still a bit finicky if you decide to actually try to do it. Some of the attacks to me aren't super well telegraphed. Of course, some of them have awkward delays to them. And at least the jumping ground shield bash has a very unnecessary lingering hitbox. I understand it's supposed to be some kind of shockwave, but it still does the full damage of the attack anyway. It's also a bit dirty that the first boss you encounter has magic deflection, because I can tell it from personal experience, a lot of wizards don't learn to not spam spells even when you return it to their faces. All in all, I do feel like this is an accurate bad omen for how bosses will be handled. Nevertheless, you mostly can still learn this fight fairly decently, so I'll give it a B tier. Let's take a moment to discuss the map now. The base canvas of this is pretty much entirely a drawn map with minimal UI help, pretty much only having details or hints drawn into the actual painting itself, which is kind of Breath of the Wild-esque. Neither of them will have actual UI elements helping you unless you already visit that area to begin with, which many have already discussed, how it's a good contrast to what, say, Ubisoft tends to do. I would say it's pretty much almost perfect. I only wish that Graces told you if you cleared a boss or not. Say if you left a cave or something and to leave it for later, but you couldn't remember exactly if you cleared it or not. Sure, you can always just leave a stamp, but shut up. Now here's an interesting situation that happened to me. Because of the way I tend to play these games, I normally wouldn't rest at a Grace unless if I pretty much needed something out of it. So say in this case, if I needed to increase my flasks or something or level up. But generally if I clear an area of enemies, I don't really want to reload them right away, even if I find a Grace. So I normally won't sit at them, and even if I die, why would I sit on them, you know? This exact playstyle made me miss Melina for a while in my first playthrough, because you pretty much are forced to rest to be able to find her. Now this probably won't be a problem for 80% of players or so, but it definitely feels like it could have been done better. Mechanically though, this is a pretty good compromise between being able to level anywhere, like in Dark Souls 1, but still creating another iconic level up maiden like in the other games. Let's talk about the catacomb levels in this game. As someone who doesn't use Spirit Ashes almost at all, catacombs are thankfully a place I hardly ever visit. There's a handful of standard catacombs, I'm sure you know which I'm talking about if you played through most of them. Those are really cool and clever. But like 80% of them are incredibly repetitive, and most of them have the stupid imp enemies. I'm not opposed to ambushes in these games at all, but when you come to expect ambushes from a stupid imp around the corner more so than not, what's even the point? I genuinely believe if they simply cut the imp enemies and replace them with other enemies, the catacombs would hold up a lot better. I made a poll on YouTube asking if people prefer the catacombs from this game or the chalice dungeons from Bloodborne, since that's what they're obviously inspired by, and at least with this sample size, they prefer chalices, which I'm inclined to agree. Generally speaking, chalice dungeons can benefit any character, and to me they're not nearly as annoying, but perhaps there's a bit of Stockholm Syndrome there because I did chalices for pretty much all my characters of PvP back in the day. The boss at the end of this particular dungeon is one of the Black Knife Assassins, so I kind of want to take that chance to raid Electo in particular, as that's the Black Knife Assassin that shows up in the tier list. And I want to say it's an A tier. It's a pretty fun fight actually. If you come too early, it can definitely be very difficult, but if you learn it properly, you can mostly get through it reliably. While I'm at it, I'm going to rate the Watchdogs as well, because I don't think I fought any in this playthrough. Also an A. Very cool design and very interesting concept. Can be misused once in a while in this game, but I wouldn't put that against the actual individual ones themselves. I did fight a couple of TVA Mariners in this playthrough, and I don't have as much nice things to say about them. I appreciate the concept, it's pretty unique in that regard, but there's not really much challenge to fighting them generally speaking, and aside from them teleporting, they're just pretty much sitting ducks. And even later in the game, as long as you stick close to them, they won't summon the big skeletons that will be more effective at defending them, and the little ones are generally just a nuisance. So I think I want to put that in C tier. I also think I didn't find any death birds, so I also want to rank them now. I think I'll rate them as a B. I think I used to have them as A before, but they're actually quite annoying. I love their design and the concept behind them, but they have a sort of a sporadic moveset. The Deathrite birds especially can do a lot of damage. So say from using weapons that are particularly good against them, they can be a pretty big challenge, but I don't always feel like they're the most fair. Maybe it's a skill issue, I don't know. But B is still pretty good, I would say. Alright, so here is the first semi-mandatory boss. As I alluded with the Tree Sentinels, I have a pretty big problem with the amount of delays that are hard to read on a lot of bosses in this game, and it's very clearly shown with Margit. If you think about this realistically, if Margit were to try to do moves like this while fighting someone its own size, you'd get obliterated with how open he's leaving himself. This was a problem in Dark Souls 3 as well, but my god did they seriously overplay them in Elden Ring. This certainly comes across as a way FromSoft is trying to make the boss harder for the experienced crowd, a problem that I think we'll see a few more times in different ways, rarely being done in a good way. I will discuss my full thoughts on what I think about the bosses of the game in general towards the end of the video, but let me just say for now that I think this is a misplaced priority to have. Anyways, back to Margit himself. Despite my rant, this boss is fine. It's definitely gonna be among the hardest bosses in the game if you get here early, but I don't necessarily take it as a bad thing. I think it's a second reaffirmation that you can go elsewhere if you feel like you're not ready to take on a certain boss or area, and once you clear this guy, the game knows to allow you to challenge the castle ahead. Also, his tail looks very cuttable, and they didn't let us cut it. B tier. But now we're getting to the bread and butter of FromSoft design. Stormveil Castle is a magnificent introduction to the Legacy dungeons. The first thing you get offered is two different paths you can take to traverse the castle. The back alleyway or through the main gate, and the dialogue very clearly indicates that pros and cons are both. If you take the back alleyway, it'll be more long-winded but much safer and more manageable. And if you take the main gate, you'll reach your destination faster but you'll be bombarded by enemies, making it far more risky. Even despite this early choice, the level design of the area is fantastic. The back alley path reminds me a lot of Boletaria 1-1 from Demon's Souls, and that's a great compliment in my books. There's plenty to explore, but you can do as much or as little as your heart pleases here. But you'll definitely be rewarded by lots of loot, and even stuff like upgrade materials if you choose to explore. Now for the first Shard Bearer. Unfortunately, Godrick does feel like he's rid of a lot of the problems we've already discussed, and he has the same issue with poor telegraphing as I mentioned too. Outside of that, the wind attack comes out a little too fast for my taste. Depending if you just attacked, you might be locked in place. But I do feel like Godrick might age slightly better than Margit. He does pale in comparison to all of the other shard bearers in presence at least, but that's very lore appropriate, so I wouldn't necessarily knock it points for that. And it probably makes him an ideal first shard bearer, which is likely to be the case for 95% of players. I don't got much else to add. You can probably infer my general feelings on him from my statement about delayed attacks and such, so he also falls in B tier alongside Margit.
I am the Lord of all that is golden, and one day we'll return together to our home, bathed in rays of gold.
When I first arrived in Liurnia in my first playthrough and saw the vast lake, I was very overwhelmed and put it off for a while. On repeat playthroughs, it's not nearly as intimidating, especially if you know what you need and don't need and can skip about. But it's not the most fun to go through if you don't have much you need in this area and just want to get to Altus. It's a very long linear map that you have to traverse every time if you want to make it to the ravine elevator or the lift to Altus. Part of me wishes Caelid was also connected to Altus so you can take that path instead. But if you really want to bypass it entirely, you technically could. Here's what you can do. You have to beat both Godrick and Radahn. You go through the impact crater to reach Nokron, go to the Shifa aqueducts, and kill valiant gargoyles. Take the coffin to the Deathroot Depths, kill Fia's champions, then teleport to the portal at the end, which you can only use once you defeat 2 shard bearers, hence killing Godrick as well. This lands you inside Leyndell capital without needing to set foot in Liurnia or even Altus Plateau, and thus allows you to skip the Draconic Tree Sentinel if you're tired of fighting him too. My friend Ashwin actually did exactly this in her first playthrough without knowledge of it before she ever reached Altus. Of course, this way of doing things are slightly hardcore, but if you take the time to explore Caelid proper, you likely could level up enough to feasibly face Radahn and the gargoyles. That said, I don't think it's a bad region per se. It's simply very hit or miss on repeat playthroughs since depending on your build, you may not need much here, save for golden seeds and sacred tears. Now unfortunately, Raya Lucaria Academy is definitely the worst legacy dungeon in my opinion. It doesn't feel like a proper school almost at all. It is terribly linear, has a mandatory midway boss, which I don't hate the Red Wolf, B tier, but it's just too small for it to have something like this to begin with. It's definitely an anomaly that this area is so bland. If I had to guess, perhaps they spent too much time on the entirety of Liurnia and ended up having to cut development time on Raya Lucaria, but if so, that was definitely a bad call. Most players will be more focused on getting to the academy, since Rennala is one of the easiest shard bearers, and the respec mechanic is a little too useful to not unlock eventually at least. I get the impression that FromSoft drew out the map of the game before designing the game, and while if so, that's kinda cool in its own right, it feels like a massive trap for actual game development when it ends up restricting you. It feels like Breath of the Wild likely had a similar approach and just ended up with the map being too big, and a lot of the empty space had to be filled with Korok seeds and the like. Now onto the main attraction, as we mentioned already, Rennala. Which, by the way, I forgot to do early in the playthrough, so I guess you get to see my nearly completed build. I actually like this boss a lot. As long as it's done well, I'm all for gimmick bosses in the FromSoft games, but this one did a very smart thing, which was to separate the boss into 2 phases, one being a little more gimmicky, but the second being closer to an actual fight. Of course, once you know the gimmick for the first phase, it's not too hard to get through, but also doesn't take a long time to get through once you know what you're doing. I don't have a lot of complaints for phase 2. Rennala is a very competent pure magic caster boss, and I feel like that's not very common in the FromSoft games necessarily. Dark Lurker comes to mind, maybe Fool's Idol if you're open to gimmick bosses, and if you like Rennala phase 1, I'm willing to bet you will like her as well. Perhaps the RNG of the Spirit Ashes summoning can be a little tedious, but it doesn't usually bother me casually. So this is gonna be my first S tier.
Little Rani, my dear daughter, weave thy night into being.
As I sort of hinted earlier, my first path to Caelid was through the transporter chest, and it definitely left an impression on me once I left that cave. This is a fantastic area in my opinion. It's an early accessible challenge if you want to go for it, but you can also never touch it if you're a coward. I mean, if you don't want to go through here. I want to talk about Ixyx as the representative of the flying dragons in general. They're a pretty good boss design, very fair, but Ixyx is a fair bit harder with his rod cloud that makes it more interesting as well. This is the boss type that a few could take on and rule level 1 with no upgrades, and you can do well with it as long as you learn the moveset, which is very well telegraphed. The only thing keeping it from S is that I wish they had one or two more attacks to differentiate them from each other, as they generally only have one. Exile himself would probably take S tier, but in general, flying dragons are an A. The only reason I'm willing to give Miyazaki a pass for his hard-on for poison swamps in this game is because he can ride a horse through most of them, and the good chunk of the ones where he can't, the poison is generally manageable without having to be poisoned. There's one obvious exception, but we'll definitely be getting to that later. In this main swamp, of course, we can find Commander O'Neill, the one whose name has been hilariously described to me as a real-life general getting isekai'd into the world of Elden Ring. Unfortunately, this boss is very meh to me. I don't mind the first phase where you have to dispatch the crossbowmen and then fighting him alone. While a little bit riddled with the usual delayed attacks, it's very manageable, and they're telegraphed enough so it's not a problem. The problem for me arises from when he summons the axe-wielding enemies. These guys are far too aggressive and hard to split up to be able to deal with them. And if they all attack you at once, you're almost certainly dead, unless you're super overleveled for this fight. Half the time when I end up fighting this boss early, I end up jumping over some roots in an effort to split them off and kill them away from the boss, which can work well, but it's very hit or miss in my experience. For all this, it gets a C from me, although it's not in a tier list thing. I was ready to absolutely slam Redmane Castle for also being a disappointing legacy dungeon, but in Extra Life this is labeled as a minor legacy dungeon, and that kind of makes me realize, yeah, okay, this is not as bad for what it is. Mind you, the fact that one of the most noteworthy shard bearers in the game doesn't have a proper legacy dungeon is a little bit disappointing, but perhaps they want to take a different approach with him with the whole Radahn Festival event. I still don't think Redmane Castle is that interesting. I rarely ever have a need to come here before the festival, so honestly I don't even know this area very well at all, and I don't find it designed that interesting, so meh. Now on to Radahn himself. Man, this boss gives me whiplash. At first I absolutely hated this guy. More delayed attacks, along with having a dual weapon, meaning there's two separate hitboxes that will destroy you if you don't dodge them absolutely perfectly. In order to be properly leveled for this guy in your first playthrough, without going Altus at all, you have to absolutely ravage the entirety of Caelid, so in some sense you have to explore most of the map available to you so far in order to not get decimated by Radahn. Now, as a Souls veteran purist extraordinaire like myself, I normally wouldn't mind just learning the fight a little underleveled. The problem for me even trying that was his run-up. I hated how long it takes to even reach Radahn after you go through the portal. I normally would love a cool semi-scripted sequence like that, but not only do the arrow scatter shots sometimes just hit you while on horse, which is needless chip damage before you even get to the fight, when you finally get to him, the fact that you can be 1 or 2 shot within seconds, just ugh. It takes between 40 to 50 seconds to get from the Stake of America respawn to being in melee range of him, and with load and death screens, it's a minute or so. Hope you see what I'm getting at. Resetting attempts with this nerd is just atrocious. Now all of this is only discussing the first encounter of him. If we're talking about how he holds up after having good knowledge of the game, he might be quite the opposite. Once you know how to build your character efficiently, knowing to level Vigor early on, upgrading weapons to like halfway their max upgrade or higher, and God forbid if you use Frost, Bleed, or Black Flame, he just doesn't stand a chance almost at all. So I hope you can see what I mean with this boss giving me whiplash. It's one that can vary wildly depending on how you go about the game, which I know is just a problem in open world games like this. But even that aside, once you know how to fight him and deal with him, he's not really that fun to fight anyway, at least for me. Also, I should mention that he's been nerfed and rebuffed several times, so I don't really know where he stands relative to release anymore. Also, I should mention that there's summons in the arena, which definitely break the fight even further, but I don't generally take summons into account when I'm criticizing boss design or difficulty. The number of bosses that are made harder with summons in the Soulsborne games is close to 0. I do like the idea of having a whole raid for this boss, but it felt kind of half-assed. I prefer how it was done in Dark Souls 2 with Ivory King, for instance. Anyway, I guess B tier? I can't say he's bad enough to be mid, but I also don't love him clearly. At least he's not a nuisance when you're playing the game. We're gonna take a quick detour to Weeping Peninsula, but I won't be long. I don't got much to say about it, to be honest. For a first playthrough, this area is a good way to go if you're having trouble with like Margit and want to explore another area that is not too bad. But after the first playthrough, I don't find much reason to come here, except for the sacred tears you get here, which can be an annoying detour. There are a handful of weapons and equipment that you can find here, but even then, when you get them, there's really much else, at least in my experience. Also, I'm about to blow at least some of y'all's mind right now. This place is called Weeping Peninsula. It's always raining. You get sacred tears here? Yeah. Castle Morn is a fine mini dungeon, probably among the better ones, but I feel like most of these don't really have much to comment on either. They tend to be big open castles with a few doors and ladders here and there. Not quite copy pasted or anything, but yeah, they definitely have like a template to go off of. I did always like when enemies fight each other in these games though, just adds a tiny bit more to the world. So at least it's got that going on. I don't got much good things to say about Leonine Misbegotten. They always annoy me with their mix of delayed attacks, aggressiveness, and back-to-back hits that are awkward to roll. I give him his just desserts by coming here at a higher level. C tier. To get to Altus, I'm going to take the Ruins Precipice area, and I'm going to take that opportunity to talk about the tunnel mines in general. They're good. There's not an absurd amount of them. A few of them are very just enough to make them stand out from each other. And while the layout is still similar, it helps you identify that it is a mine as opposed to a normal cave. And you always know what to expect to find here, and should benefit any build whatsoever. They also don't have the gimmick of the lever or anything, which I don't think is bad necessarily, but it doesn't drag as long as a result. We will be talking about the non-tunnel caves soon, but for now, good note on these. I like Magma Worm's design and lore and everything, but they can definitely be extraordinarily annoying to fight. Their charge attack has a constant hitbox running, they leave lava behind, they'll sometimes do charge attacks back to back, etc. Phase 2 isn't terrible, but their tilt in place trying to aim at you for the slam down looks ridiculous. It already has a massive hitbox anyway, why do they have to change directions, you know? This maybe isn't much of a problem with Makar, but with Theodorix, it can be a massive pain in the ass. That is a very difficult fight. C tier, unfortunately. Reaching Altus is another pretty memorable moment, especially if you end up taking the path where you get ambushed by Landsacks. It's definitely the type of place that feels like it lives up to the hype after a lot of build up. There's plenty to explore if you want to, but the path to the Earth Tree is very clear if that's your only goal. Okay, let's use the Sage's Cave to talk about caves in general, excluding catacombs and mines. These are also fine, there's varying qualities between them, but a lot of the more mundane ones are fairly short, but there's also a handful of standouts. Sage's Cave is among the interesting ones at least. It has a unique design, has the illusory wall gimmick, and it even has 2 bosses. So all in all, I think the problem in these underground type areas mostly falls in the catacombs, that generally go for a certain minimum length, repeat the structure a bit too much, and since they all have the lever structure, it can feel pretty repetitive as well. I will say though, one of the biggest pros of replaying this game in general is how you are actively able to skip whatever content you don't want to do, as we sort of touched on here and there. But to summarize in general, I've actively heard people say they've enjoyed follow-up playthroughs to this game more than their first playthrough, because they'll only do the content they want to do. Since a lot of them were actively trying to explore every inch and corner of the map, they eventually burnt out, especially with the areas they found bothersome. That in itself is an issue of its own from a game design standpoint, but since we're talking about how Elden Ring holds up after some time has passed, I think mentioning how the second, third, fourth playthroughs hold up is an important factor. The worm-faced enemies and bosses have such a cool design, and the deathbite thing is quite interesting. The boss variant is a little awkward to fight with how big it is, and how hard it is to see what they're doing sometimes. They also have one deathbite attack that feels like it has multiple separate clouds that can cause instant deathbite, and because of the last point, it can sometimes be hard to tell when this move is happening. These things are keeping it just shy of S tier and A. I believe this apostle was the first Godskin I encountered, and I fell in love with this boss right away. I'm already a sucker for the Black Flame type of stuff from the previous games, and I also love Twin Blades, so I always knew I wanted his healer weapon. Even though a few of his attacks can be a little weird and come out really fast, I do feel like you can learn it pretty well. It gets a solid S from me. Great design, probably best song in the game, pretty cool fight overall. The Shaded Castle is one of the more memorable mini dungeons with the Poison Swamp. It has enough different than the other ones to differentiate it, aside from the Poison Swamp as well, with the 2 semi-circle-esque design. There's not a ton of unique loot here, but being an optional area, there's not much reason to come here at all unless you need something. I will say having to come all the way here for the prosthetic every time is quite annoying though. The Briar is quite cool, but man is it obnoxious to fight for me, especially the Bell Hunter that spawns in Caelid. It feels like that one's scaled for endgame. It definitely suffers a bit from delayed attacks, and to me right now some of the magic swings look a little too similar to differentiate, but maybe that's a skill issue on my part. I'll give it a B. I can probably learn this one better. Before going into Leyndell, let's discuss Mount Gelmir and the Volcano Manor stuff. This whole region isn't nearly as big as all of the areas I've discussed so far, but it's almost a more ideal size. I would estimate it has give or take as much content as Altus Plateau, if you exclude the Royal Capital segment at least, but it's far more compact, and it still has a few branching paths that you can take or ignore as you please. The only downside I will say about this is that getting to the Volcano Manor on foot from the beginning of Mount Gelmir can take a little while, but if you know what you're doing you can teleport there from the beginning of Altus with Raya's help, or maybe with the abducted version in Raya Lucaria. Let's take a brief look into Gelmir Hero's Grave. The heroes' graves are also worth mentioning in the underground area bracket. There's so little of them that there's no way to burn out of them, so unless you really hate the stone chariots, which I know some people do, these stay pretty fresh. I always loved the chariots, they're borderline horror game material, and I love that you can't just destroy them conventionally. It's a pretty good semi-scripted scenario to me. Originally I was disappointed that they nerfed it to not one-shot you unless you were at super high level, but in retrospect it was a bit much, and I can't deny that I need that padding sometimes. We're gonna take this one tree spirit to kind of represent all of them. I don't absolutely hate the tree spirits. Their design are quite cool, I think, and they remind me a lot of the last boss of Sonic Adventure 2, but they're definitely very weird to read and dodge. They'll sometimes drag you around in their collision to get caught into that hitbox, I feel like. So even if you dodge properly, you may just get hit anyway. A lot of the locations they decide to put these guys on are very claustrophobic too, so that certainly doesn't help. C tier, can't really put it higher. I don't generally enjoy fighting these guys when I need to. The Volcano Manor questline is pretty bare bones and has no real gravity on the story, like what they claim their purpose is. Really feels like an ending related to them would have been fitting. However, the actual Volcano Manor level is pretty great as well. Another legacy dungeon hitting it on the mark. Again, like mentioned earlier, if you take the abducted virgins in the academy and take a possibly unintended skip, you could even arrive here early and through a different segment than normal. I will say that the first half is a bit better than the second is a little too linear for my taste. Although there's a few branching paths to explore for loot, they don't connect back to where you were very well. Some leading back to the beginning of the legacy dungeon entirely, or the manor itself, so that's a little disappointing. I don't generally look forward to exploring the second half, I'd just rather warp to Rykard with a questline since I generally get the Take Yours cameo in every playthrough. So perhaps it's not the best dungeon, but it's not bad either. Now I did kind of brush off Red Wolf earlier for being a mid-dungeon boss, but it feels like that dungeon is actively harmed by a mini boss being in the middle. Godskin Noble feels well placed. Phase 1 of this fight is perfectly fine, but I think Phase 2 is where things take a turn for the worse. While there are ways to avoid the rolling attack just fine, if geometry gets in the way of you or the Noble, that can quickly go out the window. Not to mention sometimes Noble will keep rolling even after it hits you, which can happen if you get hit early into its attack. Sometimes you can also get double hit, I think I've noticed, and God forbid redoing this guy in multiplayer, it'll sometimes hit you, it'll stop its rolling animation, and then animation cancel back into the roll. It's atrocious. That's all one attack. The other attack that is complete BS is the Noble's presence. There's no way to react to this on sight, you have to predict it, if that's even really possible. So unfortunately a fairly good fight just goes haywire in Phase 2, so I have to dock it a few points, putting it in B tier. You can definitely use all the cheese strats to bypass all that crap, and while it's annoying, it's not always a run killer, but it's still a bit bad in my opinion. The Serpent Hunter is probably the best incarnation of the Storm Rulers and Demon Souls, although there's probably not much competition in that regard. And I mean that both in the sense that there's not a lot of attempts to it, and that those set of attempts are awful. Yorm is an awful attempt at it. I'm not gonna get into it now, lest I go into an entire rant not related to Elden Ring. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, just comment it and I'll link a timestamp to my FromSoft boss ranking. I think the Divine Dragon is a comparable comparison that is good, but not quite the same either. Anyway, back to Rykard. What I think makes this version of the Storm Ruler good is that this weapon has a whole proper moveset that all will cause damage to Rykard, making it feel like a normal fight with a giant boss, but actually being able to see the boss at a distance. To me, a borderline feels like a mecha fight or something of the sort, maybe like something in Nier Automata. That said, this boss does have some blatant issues as well. For me, the main one that annoys me is the Earthquake attack in Phase 1, that seems to be undodgeable in normal circumstances. Now, light roll might help you with it, but considering we didn't even have that option with a worse light roll until it got buffed, I don't think that's an excuse. Not when having an acceptable roll like mid roll is not good enough unless if you're a certain distance from it. Now, I have seen people be able to block it without having that much stamina or a good shield, but I don't know. Something doesn't feel right about FromSoft adding these unreliable or undodgeable attacks to their bosses, like this or the Noble's Presence attack we just discussed. To me, it comes across as them trying to counter the no-hit crowd or something. That's a pretty petty reason if so. Second phase is okay, I think. I used to have a problem with the skull attack phase that leads into the giant charge attack, but I've learned that simply getting far enough from Rykard will allow you to outspace the beam, meaning you only have to focus on the skulls. I do still think the Earthquake attack is bad enough that I'll have to bring it down a peg, so A tier. I feel like due to the sheer number of bosses in Elden Ring, more gimmick bosses could have been warranted to spice up the variety. I certainly would prefer that over all the repeats if done well. The only bosses I would fully consider gimmicks are Rennala and Rykard, and maybe something like Crucible Knight's Snowcaller. The others that could come to mind more so have small gimmick elements rather than being a full gimmick fight. And Rennala is only half gimmick, really. Now back to what's essentially the main goal of the first half of the game. 2/3? I'm a third into the script, so I guess it depends how you explore. This is probably the best legacy dungeon in the game. It still has some competition coming up, but I'd say it's at least among them. If you know what you're doing, you can sort of beeline straight to Godfrey and Morgott, but there's still plenty of things to explore and see. There's even the whole other dungeon that connects from this place. You could maybe argue this is a little too big and winding. I can't say with 100% certainty that I remember every single nook and cranny, but I also feel like if I took my time, I could explore this area fairly thoroughly as well. It's also very stunning, of course. Grandsack is such an eye-catching set piece that surprisingly turns out to be helpful to getting to the Erdtree itself. Symbolic, perhaps? Anyway, I don't know how else to praise in the area, so I'll leave it at that. I don't think I've heard anyone actively dislike this area, but if they do, they're wrong! This is probably as good as a place as any to discuss the Erdtree avatars. Yes, they're pretty on the nose reskins of the Asylum Demon from Dark Souls. They legitimately share a handful of animations, but it does have a lot of new aspects as well. Now to me at least, this doesn't bother me because the Erdtree avatars tend to serve a specific role, at least in the minor Erdtrees, and that's of course dropping the physic crystal tears. So there's definitely a certain anticipation to killing one near those, and after a while it becomes a little fun to be able to fight the avatars in all honesty. And they even find interesting ways to make them harder throughout the game, such as the P-Tread avatars, or the ones that clone themselves. But that said, it's definitely not a super incredible fight by any means, so I don't feel like I can rank it that high, so I'll give it a B. Now on to Goldfree. I was very surprised when I first got here. Last thing I expected was fighting an Elden Lord, but it also wasn't that hard. It's kind of a satisfying fight, but I also can't say it's that impressive either. There's no phase transition with different movesets. You can't do pretty much any status effect besides sleep, apparently, so it can be limiting depending on your build. I don't know, I don't have too many explicit opinions, but it's not bad by any means. There's just not much to comment on either, so I'll give it a B as well. Now on to the King of Kings. I know I had my complaints with Margit earlier, but this fight being an extension of that kinda helps it because you'll recognize his moveset a little bit. A lot of attacks that annoy me the most, he doesn't really do anymore, and it's a much faster paced fight. He still has some awkward attacks to dodge depending on your spacing, but it still feels like this is an improvement. Phase 2 is interesting too, having the bleed aspect of it to tie him a little bit to his brother. I will say though, the little eruptions in the water are very uncalled for after the initial phase transition. They're just a random factor that are hard to account for in such a fast-paced fight. Maybe it sounds like it would be an S tier fight, but I don't know. It's not necessarily a fight I look forward to much, despite it being mostly good, so A tier I guess. I'm not making a very good case for these last few bosses, am I? Before going forward into the story, let's take a detour to the Subterranean Shunning grounds. And look, I don't mind levels like this necessarily, but it's definitely not the most fun to go through whenever you absolutely need something from here, especially if it's towards the end of the area. So contrary to a handful of the areas we talked about so far, this area probably ages worse the more you play the game, because it can be a handful. It doesn't even have that much good loot, especially in the pipe system, which is the most annoying part to get through, even when you know exactly where to go. The catacombs below are actually one of the better ones in the game, but that doesn't really give Shunning Grounds points in my opinion. So let's just move on and forget this place existed. Omen mode does have a handful of awkwardly delayed attacks, but the full swings are still telegraphed fairly well, and you know when you're about to get hit, making it still most linear if you don't roll right. The blood flame element I always thought was pretty damn cool, even though the bleed buildup can be quite annoying. I actually don't have any major critiques for this fight. Maybe the fact that it's also immune to status again, but it does also feel a little monotonous without a phase transition or something. By the way, that's not to say that a fight needs a phase transition to keep it spicy or anything. It just feels like it lacks something for these two that I mentioned that in. Anyway, it's on the tier list, but A tier? Again, maybe not making the best cases, but a good sign for the later fight? Question mark? Of course, after here is a path that leads to the Frenzy of Flame ending. Platforming in the FromSoft games have always been contentious, because aside from Sekiro, these games have never had a dedicated jump button, but still insisted to have tricky platforming. And that combined with potentially janky camera, it just results in a lot of infuriation. Now that said, because this game does have a jump button, it's not as bad. That may vary from person to person. personally I don't have a problem with it. But it's worth mentioning that there isn't a ton of platforming like this in the game at all, and even something like this is technically optional. But if you want to do the Lord of Frenzied ending, you're SOL. Personally, I did Lord of Frenzied Flame ending in my first playthrough because I was proud of finding it on my own, and I do like it a lot. Anyone seen Neon Genesis Evangelion, by the way? Now let's get back on track for the main story. I've heard from many people that in their first playthrough, this is around a part of the game where they started to really burn out if they were exploring pretty thoroughly. And while this can be mitigated somewhat in future playthroughs by only playing the content you want to play, it doesn't entirely save it. Mountaintop of the Giants is similar to Liurnia in that it can be a chore to get through on repeat playthroughs with how incredibly linear the path of progression is. Again, this is especially so if you don't need anything in the area, but given that it's so barren compared to the other areas, the likelihood that you need something here is even less so. I can't even defend this one by saying you could theoretically bypass it with some really off the beaten path method. You're just forced to go through here every single time you play through the game if you want to beat it. As much as the snowy area is really intriguing when you first come here, it has too many flaws that allow it to hold up well in any playthrough. Some would argue that the game could have and should have ended in Leyndell, as we were led to believe at first. I don't know if I necessarily go that far. I think with some tweaking this area could have been done well, but certainly cutting down the size of it is a start. Unfortunately, I don't feel like Castle Soul is a great mini dungeon either. It suffers from the same template I mentioned before, even repeating having the lions like Redmane or Fort Gale. But on top of that, some enemies, especially the dual-wielding Banished Knights, are exceptionally brutal. There's one particular ambush on release that was especially dirty. You essentially would try to sneak up on an enemy that would absolutely not know you were there, but he would then teleport behind you and does his most lethal combo. I believe after a certain patch this got toned down, but my god was that ridiculous. Regardless of that though, this area still isn't my favorite. Also don't usually have great time invading here, which feels counterintuitive since I have enemies on my side in those cases, but most of the dangerous enemies are off on the side areas, meaning that anyone who knows how to navigate this area would bypass most of them. Normally that could be a potential pro, but I also don't remember there being a lot of good loot here either, so there's not much reason to explore this as far as I remember. Of course, the main reason anyone still comes here is to get the second half of the medallion to get to the Haligtree, which is behind the second commander. However, I do have much nicer things to say about this guy than O'Neill. The round of spirit summons in this case can be really rough if you don't have the DPS to kill the dual-wielding one fast enough, but he also tends to be more aggressive than the shield one in Nile, so you can usually pull him away at least. The second phantom could still be dangerous, but as long as you're careful and patient, it can go just fine. But now onto the actual boss, this one is a lot more dynamic than O'Neill, and not too insanely riddled with delayed attacks that are hard to read. This boss is more so about punishing being greedy with too many hits, and trying to swing too early if you haven't seen the full combo through, which is also partly an aspect for O'Neill, but this one has a lot more situations like that, and a far more expanded moveset overall. On first playthrough, I hated this guy because of all of this, but as I learned the boss, it actually became quite fun to fight him, and you can be pretty aggressive as long as you're calculated when you strike. The only thing that keeps him from S tier for me is that the boss does feel a little generic, if that makes sense. There's not much for me to feel like stands out as much as some of the most unique bosses in the game, and it certainly doesn't help that it's a reskin as well. So another A tier there, I don't know if I necessarily explain well why it doesn't feel good enough to put an S, but the more I think about it, when I look at an S tier boss fight in the other From Software titles, generally it takes just a little bit more than being mechanically good or tight to push it to be special for me, which might explain why I can have an affinity for gimmick bosses that are done really well, because generally you can't get that boss experience with any other boss. Speaking of which, let's talk about a boss that tried to be special but fell flat in doing so. At first I didn't hate the Fire Giant. I would give it some credit when I first played the game, and I don't necessarily know that I despise it now. But the more I play the game, the worse this boss aged. He has a stupid amount of HP, which I suppose makes sense, but still very annoying. Of course, we all know the very annoying rolls it does, which whatever. But what I find the most annoying about it is how they can do damage. With this huge hitbox and the camera not really being made for being so close to a huge boss like this, sometimes it'll catch you off guard and hit you without you knowing it's coming. The first phase is more manageable because of the leg being an accessible weak point, but the second phase can be a pain in the ass. The best time to get real good damage in is after the phase transition, and this is when it's most dangerous to get close to him. Because both the Firestorm attack and the Erupting Rock thing can either one-shot you or lock you into getting two-shot by another one of the same attack. After this, the weak point is supposed to be the eye or his head, but both are pretty much inaccessible for melee builds. But even ranged builds can have a weird time aiming at them, though I have more limited experience with that. So yeah, not much good things to say. I like the theme and design, but I don't find execution good almost at all. The only thing I'll give it credit for is that it can be a little interesting to figure out in challenge runs, like for instance I did a bow only run, and this one can certainly push your resources, so you can get creative. But regardless, D tier. Farum Azula is a very visually striking area, but imagine unless you've been reading up on lore through items and stuff, you wouldn't have seen this coming at all, making it a huge surprise. As for level design, it starts out a little bit linear, but I think it's fine to get you accustomed to the area, and to be a little more careful with lethal ledges. It's worth noting that there's not a lot of bottomless pits in most of the mandatory areas you've been to so far, save for being at the edge of the map and such. I think that could have been a conscious choice, perhaps not, but even if unintentional, it works out that way since these instant death falls will be all around you from now on. They also introduced the fact that you'll be encountering the ancient dragons a little regularly by just having a non-boss version of one ambush you. Soon after that is when the area starts to open up gradually. You can go down to the Warmface area or continue in the right direction. Not that you would know exactly which is which at the time. Then after that there's a mid-dungeon boss which you can tackle from a few different doorways, and then after the boss there's a few different paths again. It starts to close off again towards the end, but given that you're on the last stretch of exploration of the mandatory segment of the game, I think that's fine. Though I will say the segment with the red lighting from the dragon and the eagles is definitely very frustrating when you're trying to run by. But trying to speedrun through it is kind of on us type of situation. It's not too bad if you take your time. As you can probably tell, I think pretty highly of this legacy dungeon as well. It's among my favorites. Now let's back up a bit and discuss the mid-dungeon boss. I don't despise this boss, but looking back on the previous bosses in the From Software catalog, it's hard to believe this could happen. The superficial comparison everyone is gonna make is Ornstein and Smell from Dark Souls 1, and while yes, there's some aspects that they share, for instance the pillars in the arena for crowd control, the visual similarities between the two, etc., they are mechanically more like Four Kings, where they share a direct health bar and the ideal situations that take one down before another one can respawn. You can even hit a dying one a few more times to lower its max health more, like the Four Kings. But as you know, both of these are spawned from the beginning, and in truth are just very poorly matched together. They are both as aggressive as the other, there's not one that's clearly supposed to be a little slower to get to you to keep them apart, and the pillars in the room aren't always reliable at keeping them apart, especially if the noble goes into phase 2. They both have long range punish attacks, which they generally cast when you're healing, so even if you do get them apart, the other can still hit you. And God forbid you get them both in phase 2 at the same time. This is very clearly a very slapdash attempt at having a dual fight akin to the previous ones in the series, but with two recurrent enemies that were never really intended to be in the same room together, which is unfortunately somewhat common in this game. But we're talking about a mandatory boss here. There's an argument to be made that the game expects you to use Spirit Ashes, but they've done the same type of fight but miles better many times in the past. They literally have no excuse for how poorly this boss is balanced. ONS, Four Kings, Spell Gargoyles, Ruin Sentinels, Dark Lurker, Abyss Watchers, Demon Princess, perhaps arguably Shadows of Yharnam. All of these are good, or at least better attempts at multi-enemy bosses. And some of these are from a game 10 years older. C tier, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. If I had to pick an award for the most majestic, yet menacing introduction cutscene to a boss in this series, Placidusax might be one of the top contenders. I felt like I would love this boss as soon as I saw that cutscene, and thankfully I was right. I find it a nice sort of subversion that the leader of the dragonkind is a very passive creature. After seeing Gransack and read his lore, and seeing all the other ancient dragons, you'd probably guess that their leader is perhaps the most vindictive and angriest dragon of all of them, but it seems quite the opposite. Anyway, how does the fight actually hold up? Admittedly, it's not the most action-packed at the beginning, but it's a good way to start getting you used to his moveset, since after that he'll start doing his instant transmission attack, which I think you at least start to be suitably prepared for. The dive bomb from his cloud attack I've noticed can have a finicky hitbox, but it's not nearly as bad as some of the worst in this game. As the battle ramps up, the fight will actually be quite fast-paced, being more aggressive and having to worry about a few different things. The music also picks up at this point, definitely enhancing the experience. The gold beam attack I still don't quite have down, but I was able to get Medira's beam down pretty well, so I believe I could for this as well. And of course, we have to talk about that attack. Oh my goodness, this attack makes me so wet. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to a fight having something a little extra to make it special. I genuinely don't think I've ever seen anyone being hit by this attack. Everyone who has heard this attack's high-pitched screech, along with it having the power to slow down the soundtrack to a stop, knows better than to try to challenge it. Which I believe is the first time FromSoft has done something like this. I think a boss we'll discuss later does something similar, but it doesn't have the same gravitas. I think this boss is a good showcase on how you can have a boss gradually teach you its own moveset and still be satisfying to defeat. It does pose a challenge for some, albeit not being nearly the hardest boss in the game, but it doesn't need some ridiculous undodgeable attack or hilariously delayed swings to be a challenge. Solid S tier for me. Now onto the main attraction of Farum Azula. Beast Clergyman isn't awful, but it's really annoying to have to do it every time when Maliketh is the cool part of the fight. That's not to say clergymen can't be learned or anything. You certainly can, but it's also nearly reaching the reused enemy territory, since you can fight Gronk in part of his questline. That's probably not an entirely fair assessment, since it may be the same character in lore. Not to mention you don't kill him either, but yeah. Because of the phase 2 split, Maliketh is very squishy as a result, making the fight not last too long if you have good damage, which is a little disappointing. What he does do meanwhile is generally pretty sick. It's a very cinematic fight, with him using all the pillars and stuff as an active platform, and also very active and aggressive. The Destined Death debuff is definitely a bit annoying and scary, but I guess it's fitting for one who even the gods fear. He has a few other annoyances that I still haven't quite figured out, but it's mostly a cool fight. I do want to do a rune level 1 run in the near future, so I'm supposed to learn how to counter them better then. This one definitely had S tier potential. The only thing keeping it down a bit is the clergyman, so we're gonna put it in A. Really close though.
Astonished, why cover destined death? To kill what?
After Maliketh is when the boss rush starts getting really exhausting. I like what happens to the arrow thematically, but there's really not much between you and the next boss, and only a few things to loot, although some of them are pretty good. Even though it's very cheaty, I do like how ham getting goes with all the spell types in the game. It's probably what every spellcaster in any FromSoft game wants to feel like. You do have to approach him a little bit different than the normal boss. Being aggressive generally is better for spellcaster type NPCs, rather than calculating hits and dodge from a distance, especially when he has infinite stamina and mana. That said, is it a super fun fight to revisit? Generally just kind of a nuisance to the end game, and as mentioned starting with Maliketh, it becomes pretty much a boss rush. And this is definitely the one boss I'm sure most people will cut out, probably including myself. Maybe. B tier. Godfrey is quite a good fight. The first phase obviously has an expansion of the Shade version and it does well. The second part of phase 1 with the Tremor attacks is quite creative too. Having an attack that covers the whole arena is pretty badass. Thankfully you can dodge or jump these, which can be said about every move in the game. Now for phase 2, while his wrestler revives are quite unique and cool in their own right, I can't deny it is a bit disappointing that Serosh doesn't really become a part of the fight in any way, outside of the lore implications. I don't actually know what they could do, or what I would do, but I don't know. It seems like a missed opportunity, and I know I'm not the only one that thinks that. I don't have much negative to say about him, but I do feel like it lacks something to me, so A tier it goes. Who knows if Serosh could fix this, but it is what it is. Now before we go to the end game, let's take this chance to discuss some of the option areas that I haven't gone around to yet, and other aspects of the game that aren't specific to areas. So let's start with Volcano Manor, and kind of go in the order you would need to follow to get through Ranni's questline, since a lot of these match up with it. This is one of my favorite mini dungeons in the game, but I think it might partly be because I like invading here. The area is a fair bit linear, but it has a few nooks where there are some really interesting and good items. Not to mention some interesting enemies with the hands. Plus you can come back here after you beat the boss and explore different segments of it, which I think is neat since you will notice there's some places that are hard to reach from below. So if you keep that in mind, you will be rewarded for investigating even after the boss. Speaking of the boss, Lord is pretty good. It's a good contrast from the other horse riding bosses we've encountered so far. The horse isn't really used for the fight, so as a kick it can do if you're behind it, but it gives her some really nice mobility, which actually reminds me a little bit of Torrent. I wonder if there's some connection there. The magic bow is a really cool spell obviously, it's one of those spells that you instantly want to try. The only thing that bothers me about her is that some of her attacks kind of stun lock you into a second hit, and generally moves like that annoy me. I almost don't know why they didn't just make it one hit. I think I'll put her in A tier. Now to properly explore Shifa River. One thing I love about this elevator ride is that you can actually see a sneak peek of Nokron, giving you perhaps a subtle hint that you can get to that from Limgrave as well. I absolutely adore Shifa River, although I have a lot of personal bias towards it for multiple reasons. On first playthrough, the 8 torches you have to light probably don't feel that bad, but admittedly they can drag on to do again in repeat playthroughs. But also if you don't need the reward from the normal Ancestor Spirit, you can also skip it altogether, and you'll get a better variation of the boss later anyway, with less hassle. As you explore the low river, you also see sneak peeks of Nock from here, surely making you wonder how to get up there multiple times, which I love when you take into account that it's probably exactly the conundrum that Ranni and her followers are facing. Although in their case, can Ranni just not fly? I don't know, it feels like she should be able to, or teleport or something, but I digress. If you haven't noticed with Gideon and my occasional talk about PvP, I do like PvP in these games, and I can be down for occasional PvP-esque fights if done well. Mimic tier is fun. having to fight your own build, which I imagine for some people could potentially be OP, and they could have trouble against themselves, is a very interesting way to approximate PvP, short of having something like Old Monk or Spirit of the Church. And if you want to be cheeky, of course you can do stuff like change their equipment around, or even just have them be naked so they can only throw rocks at you. Whatever your choice, I feel like it's fun, and it's fun that they allow you to do so as well. I'm gonna put it in 8 tier, I think. I think the only thing keeping it from S tier that it's not that much of a challenging new game generally. At least there's a very few situations where I felt like it was. So it's not really a big hurdle, or you don't get to appreciate the fight much. You have to remember that to get here, you have to fail Radahn of all bosses. So a lot of folks should be able to take on something like this in comparison. As mentioned, there's less torches to light, and they're more close together for this upper segment of the river, meaning that rematching the Regal Ancestor Spirit is a lot less time consuming. Speaking of which, let's just skip the normal version and discuss the Regal Ancestor Spirit, since it's just an expanded version of the fight. This fight is incredibly majestic, in huge contrast to the rest of the game's bosses, even early on. Depending on when you fight either of these variants, the difficulty can vary a lot, but if you ever come early to this fight especially, you'll be treated to a lot of things you don't normally see. If you didn't know, when the spirit teleports away, it uses one of the spectre animals as a spawn point, and it takes on a move that corresponds to the animal. And that's putting it lightly, because it's actually quite gruesome what happens when you look at it up close. But yeah, I love the OST, the sound design of the boss, etc. It's not the most challenging or mechanically fun to do, but it definitely falls into special territory for me. So S tier. Probably both variants as well, but obviously this one outclasses the other. Lastly for Shifra, let's discuss the Valiant Gargoyles. This fight is very reminiscent of Man-Eaters from Demon Souls, having the second one come in when the first Gargoyle is at half health or so, but the second one is at full health. Now Man-Eaters is a bit of a rough and unpolished dual fight, which is why I didn't name it earlier when I was mentioning good multi-enemy bosses, but I would argue even that one is better than this one unfortunately, despite the 13-year gap. When I first fought the Gargoyles, I didn't think they were that bad. They did seem to have some sort of tug of war between themselves, where one retreats and one comes forward to fight you. I think that might sort of be the case, but even if it is, the Garg's having a poison attack that's really hard to even see due to the poison being too close to the color of the water. It's not great. If you look at a Demon Princess fight in Dark Souls 3, they do something similar, but the poison attack has a very contrasting purple color, along with some delay to the actual poison effect, to allow you to get away from it. Even that aside, the Gargoyles can sometimes be a little too awkward to hit on their own, especially if you're trying to aim for the head and such. So having two together doesn't go very well. So yet another fight appears to be a combination of enemies that don't mix well, even if some consideration was had for the AI. C tier, once again I'm a disappointed dad. Ainsel is a much smaller and less emphasized river. It definitely gets overshadowed by all of Shifra, given how much content there is in there. Nevertheless, it still has some interesting things, like the mini Astels that sort of foreshadow the Prime Astel. And despite it not having as much content, it does have a lot of pretty good loot, so there's definitely reasons to come here on occasion, especially the upper main part. At least for a lower segment, there is a boss to cap off the area, being the Dragonkin Soldier of Naxxtella, and it is a really cool fight. I'm a bit of a sucker for the ice lightning element in this game, which I wish they had more of, because visually this was very stunning at least. If you come here early enough, it's definitely very intimidating and difficult, but otherwise it can be quite easy, which I should point out is starting to be a recurring comment, but alas is one of the potential cons of having a world this open. Of course, that just means if you want to fight this guy properly, you can come here earlier, but even when that would be a balanced fight, I can't say for sure. Perhaps in the 50s or so? Anyway, I think I'll rank it as an 8 tier. Some of the Dragonkin's base moveset is a bit weird to dodge, some stun lock being involved as well, so I don't think it's perfect by any means. I think maybe the difficulty of the Lake of Rot Dragonkin would have been more appropriate for the Naxxtella one, since the Naxxtella one is the only unique one. Perhaps with that it'll be more consistently challenging and would have landed on us. Speaking of which, let's move on to the Lake of Rot. This area is very visually striking to be sure, and appropriately intimidating I would say. The title of it makes no mistake that what you will encounter is Scarlet Rot, so that's good telegraphing. That's about where the compliments will end. This is one of the only areas in which you cannot use the horse to traverse the poison, but it might be the only one where you're more or less guaranteed to be rot, and the rot is very punishing. If you're patient enough and have enough rot resistance, you could potentially get through about half without taking rot, which should make the second half to get to the Grand Cloister manageable with just flasks, and the place you need to go to should be pretty apparent with the stone structures. But if you want to explore the Lake of Rot thoroughly, you're more or less guaranteed to take rot, and most likely die, unless you're loaded on rock curing items or spells. And I haven't even really mentioned how flat this area is in general, figuratively and literally. There's just not much reason to look forward to getting through here, I'm sure for most people. I feel like these days, this area is known more for the 1.0 cut enemies more so than anything in the release version of the game, and that's essentially just trivia, since a very small number of folks will play a 1.0 version as their first playthrough. So promptly moving forward to a better aspect of this area, let's check out Astel. I love this boss a lot. It's so out of place and striking in this game that it legitimately has like a horror aspect to it, almost solely on that regard. I personally found the one in the snowfield first. That was pretty tough too, my first playthrough. It's very unconventional but still fairly difficult in its own way, and I think more or less everything can be dodged reliably. Sometimes the waves of darkness it does under itself can be a little hard to skip if you're caught in mid-combo, but you can even roll those I think, though the window's tight because you gotta catch it between cycles. When I say you can dodge everything reliably, I'm also including the meteor launches. I don't know if this is common knowledge, but there should only be one meteor that directly targets you at first, so you can keep an eye out for the one that's going straight for you, and then roll 3 times, as 2 other meteors will follow closely after, but as long as you spam roll, you should be okay. This has worked pretty well for me thus far, so I'm pretty confident saying it's consistent. Since I virtually have no complaints and I praise the encounter overall, you can probably predict this is an S tier. But now let's briefly discuss the fact that it is a repeated boss. Having to fight a clone of Godrick, regardless of the lore accuracy, after you fought the main version, is lame. Having to fight an apparition of some of the named bosses? A little bit more acceptable. But those are supposed to be proper characters. Astel and something like the Ancestral Spirit, being that there are creatures that sound like they might be abundant, doesn't bother me nearly as much. Even the fact that both of them are named Astel to me is a little telling, that these should be considered like a sort of creature. And that's not to mention that the Snowfield Astel does have a new attack as well, which doesn't make it a complete copy-paste, but that will only go so far for some folks. If you think it's lame that they reused the boss, I understand. It's just not something that bothers me personally, though it may vary case by case. At some point I was considering making a point about there being 2 Eternal Cities, and how allegedly Astel destroyed one, and I was gonna be like, 1 for each? Eh? But then I realized that lore bit is referring to the nameless Eternal City, so yeah, that's why I don't do lore in this channel. There won't be much to discuss in the Moonlight Altar, but I do think it's important enough to mention. This is an area that most people will definitely be curious to how to get there from the map, so when you finally get here it's very cathartic in a sense, for sure. Part of me wishes another boss was here instead of Azula, but I guess having the rematch with a boss that likely bailed on you, and the reward of the spell you get is worth it. I think for a lot of people, this whole semi-convoluted questline is worth it for the reward of the unique ending. Ranni's a very unique and neat character, and having this NPC being so integral to the potential path of the world is really cool. She is a major player in the lore before the game even starts, so it shouldn't be a surprise I suppose, but you get what I mean. They start making our way into Fia's questline, sort of. The deeper depths are so contrasting to every other area in this game that it definitely left an impression, even contrasting from the other underground areas we've seen so far. Of course there's a fair bit of gravity here, but it's only a problem for a few segments, and getting here does take some work, so I don't think it's uncalled for to throw some challenges like this. Although that's a non-issue if you've come here from the Frenzied Flame area. This area is more compact than the other rivers, but it still has a lot to look and loot for. It's a good place to get a lot of death related items, so potentially this is a gold mine if you need those. Now for the first major boss of this area, the gimmick here is that at least if you're online, the game will take builds from other users who are also online and match you up against their builds. So odds are you'll find a lot of Rivers of Blood, Bloodhound Fang, Moonveil, etc. Of course that's only the case for like half the NPCs that are summoned, since it does summon 2 predetermined NPCs as well. Now I like the Mimitir a lot, so I should like this one, right? Well, not so much. I do think it's a missed opportunity to make this one a PvP fight instead. I don't think they should have made the 3 NPC gank the players by any means, that would have been a lot. But perhaps the second or first summon could have been a player. It could have worked as a Covenant sort of mechanic like the previous games, like Spear of the Church, where it can be summoned from anywhere in the world as long as you have the mechanic activated. Now I know some folks aren't a fan of that, but if you aren't, you likely are playing offline anyway, and this boss would not have changed from this scenario if that was the case. At least in a vacuum. Although I have a feeling a lot of PvE purists would have still been like, dang, those PvPers are ruining a boss. That's probably the only upside to this being the way it is, that we won't be getting crap. FromSoft is perfectly capable of doing a bad PvP-esque encounter on their own. This also falls flat because you can do something similar with the Greyjar encounter, where you have to summon the 3 duelists that are also share pretty much the same mechanic of having builds from online. But as it is now, I don't see a reason to not have PvP, because otherwise this fight is quite bland. I don't really know anyone in particular who likes this fight, and I can't blame them. C tier, try again next time. Now after cuddling with Fia for a while, we get Fortisax. I do like that at least one of the Ancient Dragon fights is a remembrance, but it's a little bit of an awkward one. He punishes you being too far by having the Death Cloud, and by being right under him by having the lightning attack follow you. But being where the game wants you to be in his head is not always ideal because hitting the head can be quite awkward. So I simply tend to get under him and just moderate my hits in order to dodge the lightning, which works okay usually. This boss can additionally be fairly easy if you come here post Fire Giant, which often is the case since Fia's normal questline progression is a little bit convoluted, plus the fact that Rogier is one of the earliest and one of the only NPCs who's flagged to lock progression after you progress enough to the world, but it's still a really cool boss with an amazing soundtrack. Since I kinda don't know how to fight this boss sometimes, I gotta keep it just short of S tier, but I still like the fight mostly. Another one to learn for the Rune level 1 run. Now on to Consecrated Snowfield. This area is something else. The beginning is definitely a little tedious because we all know there is loot in the low visibility areas and it's obnoxious. It would work better if it wasn't a big open field, but that's exactly what it is. Thankfully, if you don't need anything there, it isn't too bad to just go north until you reach the frozen lake, but even here things aren't great. There isn't a whole lot here that is worth it, and I feel like most people just get here to go to the Haligtree and or the Mohgwyn Palace. There is a few good items, but it's just a hassle to come all this way for 1 or 2 items you need, and they patch a lot of our skips, though I think there's 1 or 2 that might still work in 108. So let us first go to Mohgwyn. This is a pretty neat area. It's one that I'm sure you'll be able to see from a distance for a while, kinda like Nokron, so I'm sure most people have been itching to get here. And once you do, I want to say it doesn't disappoint, at least in that what you find at the end is pretty huge. The area itself is a bit small, but there's a few interesting things here that are unique enough to make it worthwhile. And when you come here early, it can be a real treat. I do feel like it was a massive missed opportunity to not make this area a PvP invasion hotspot. It could have been an area like the one after Pontiff in Dark Souls 3 that automatically expanded PvP potential. It could have been an auto Taunter's Tongue location, which would incentivize either 1v1 player PvP or for you to summon at least one person, but definitely should have kept it a 1 summon. So 2v2 invasions could be more common here, because they're very, very rare in normal invasions. Lore-wise, this is one of the main invasion factions, so I don't see why they didn't, since even Var insists that people shouldn't come here until Mohgwyn summons us, so why not have you protect them from people coming here? As for Mohgwyn himself, this was probably the most fun fight I had in my first playthrough. Fighting Mohg with blood ourselves is really freaking fun, especially when you have that one bleed talisman for instance. The first phase is obviously primarily the prep fight, besides the added countdown, which should have gotten you sufficiently suited for it. If you encountered it, I suppose. But as I mentioned in that fight, the delayed attacks are telegraphed properly enough that I don't mind them as much as some of the other fights. So yes, the Nihil attack. I had a problem with it at first, and I don't think the Purifying Tear is a super great way to mitigate it, although that's primarily due to where you find it. Not only is it a weird spot to begin with, you also won't have that invasion until a certain point in the questline or map progression. I think the tier should have been dropped by the first Mohg encounter, that would have made a lot more sense, albeit perhaps a bit on the nose. But these days I'm fine with it. I think the attack adds enough to the atmosphere that I'm willing to let it slide, even if I have to heal off the damage. I'll certainly let it slide a lot more than some of the random undodgeable attacks a lot of bosses have, because this one does come off as its ultimate attack per se. And I would argue the thing that bothers me more about this attack is that the bleed staggers you rather than it doing damage, without the Purifying Tear of course. I would say I feel bad for the hitless and damageless crowd, because even the tier doesn't stop damage, but there's plenty of strats that allow you to bypass phase 2 to begin with, so that's always something that kind of negates that part of it anyway. Now for phase 2, yes, with all the blood flame that can be scattered all around the floor, you're basically guaranteed to take some damage, but I love how chaotic this fight becomes with it too. And I don't necessarily mind taking damage myself as long as the fight feels learnable and fair. And as mentioned, you can skip phase 2 altogether if you know what you're doing. So with the hindsight of all of this, I feel this boss aged better, and I personally love it more than ever. And I've decided that it's actually my favorite boss in the game, so obvious S tier. Also, the song is pretty underrated in my opinion.
I can see it, as clear as day. The coming of our dynasty. Mohgwyn.
Haligtree time! Once again, gravity is strong in this one, and with enemies that can do long range attacks, it can be more brutal than anything we've talked about thus far. But it's important to remember that from a game's design standpoint, the hardest optional challenge can, and likely should, be more difficult than any mandatory challenge. And what awaits for us at the end of this map should be a testament to that. At the very least, you don't have to do a lot of actual platforming, it's more so about not falling, but you might have to for some particular loot if you want it. As far as I can recall, there isn't a ton of noteworthy loot here, so let's just continue a bit further. There's a bit more to loot in the town segment. There's a ton of upgrade materials, including some max upgrade materials, in case you're just shy of some of the higher level upgrade materials. There's also some max level talismans for their variants, and this is all before beating the first boss here, so it can be quite lucrative. For normal Loretta, she pretty much has an identical moveset to the Shade version, only having the bigger arrow attack and maybe more of the Phalanx glintstone things in phase 2 and such, plus hitting harder of course, so I won't discuss her much. Still late tier to me, it can be a roadblock every lower level, so if you're looking for any loot in Alfell, it might be a bit of a hurdle for you. Now for the Alfell segment, if Haligtree Town was lucrative then oh man, this is a goldmine. You can find multiple max level upgrade materials here, a lot of the most valuable talismans in the game, a few Spirit Ashes I believe, some unique weapons, and a load of glove ward. And well, a ton of runes as well if you just kill the enemies, even some of the most basic ones. Of course, in return, this area can be quite difficult, but I want to say it's mostly so if you try to rush any of the parts. If you take it slowly and aren't willing to bait out enemies one at a time, it's very manageable. Except the Revenants, those are our death sentence. A little deeper in you find a little rot lake that, while is appropriate for the area, is quite annoying due to the slow down movement it has. And rolling through it will guarantee rot if you don't have soap. So meh. Quick step or bloodhound step do wonders here. From there, the last little segment has a lot of kindred of rot that can overwhelm you if you try to rush, but again, with patience, not too bad. Overall though, I like this level a lot as Legacy Dungeon. Perhaps not my favorite, but it is quite good, and pretty much the last one, so I think it's pretty fair to say that pretty much all of the dungeons are good, minus Raya Lucaria Academy. And finally, after getting through all of that, we get to the promotional star of this game. I don't know her name though, she never tells it to us for some reason. I mentioned earlier how FromSoft tried a few different ways to make bosses harder. Malenia's healing may be the best way that they tried in this entire game. Tanking attacks with high poise and making trades can be an incredibly strong tool if you build yourself correctly, and this is a direct punish for that. I don't know if this should have gone as far as to healing her off of 100% block shields, but perhaps they knew shields would also be strong against her otherwise. However, that does almost entirely fall flat when you discuss Waterfowl Dance. Now yes, there are ways to dodge and counter this, even in close range. People have found dozens of ways to by this point. My problem with it, even still, is with how unintuitive they mostly are. A lot of the methods feel like an abuse of the AI rather than the intended way to dodge her. So unless if you're in the mid to long range, at first this attack will seem undodgeable, unless you are fast rolling. But that only applied after a certain patch, when fast rolls were buffed. I've yet to really learn any of the methods, just kind of go ham on her and try to stagger as much as possible, and simply try to bait out that attack and start running backwards. But of course that's not always reliable since she's an anxiety machine that will sometimes just do it randomly. Looking at the rest of her moveset proper though, she's very fair. Some moves punish you for spam rolling, some punish you for only dodging backwards. You really have to understand what each move requires to dodge and counter. It's only the anxiety of knowing she can waterfowl after a certain point that can hinder that a little bit, until you learn how to dodge it. But anywho, let's discuss phase 2. It's mostly a good expansion on phase 1. She mostly reuses the same attacks, except she's a little bit more aggressively chasing you, and has a few additional attacks like the little phantom summoning. I don't know what that's about, but this is one of the attacks that still kind of messes with me sometimes, since sometimes she'll do it when you're basically right in front of her. Her using the Aeonia attack a second time and onwards when you get her down to certain HP is a nice reprieve actually, and can be that last little push most people need to beat her. Maybe too good if you have a lot of good ranged options, but so be it, that's allowed in the game. And yeah, that's what a lot of people could consider the hardest boss in the game. It certainly took me the longest. Owen estimated it took around 6 to 8 hours total maybe in my first playthrough. Definitely the biggest gap in time. I think the second longest fight for me may have been Radahn and Elden Beast, but I think they took half the time or so. Originally I ranked Malenia as S tier, but after some reflection, I think I'm going to put her in A. That said, I could bump her up if I learn how to fight her properly in Rule Level 1, and just end up enjoying her vastly more due to that. I certainly wouldn't mind re-ranking all the bosses a third time. Maybe after the DLC is out?
Dearest Mikola, my brother, I'm sorry. I finally met my match.
But now that we covered most of the bosses in the game, let's discuss how they compare to the rest of the series, and just a general discussion of the bosses of this game. The narrative early on for Elden Ring was the bosses were just worse than Dark Souls 3's bosses. And while I don't entirely disagree with that sentiment, you have to realize that Dark Souls 3 is fully DLC'd already, while Elden Ring isn't. And I want to point out, most base game bosses in the previous games weren't as good as you remember. Seriously, think back on which non-DLC bosses you think are S tier quality for the games. For Bloodborne, Ebrietas, maybe Logarias. I don't personally like them that much, but it's one that people mention. Gehrman. That it? 3 bosses out of 17? From Dark Souls 3. A bit better, maybe. Abyss Watchers, Lothric, Champion Gundyr, Nameless King. Those are the ones come to my mind from the list. And that's out of 19. So I think it is a bit unfair if people are still arguing that when Elden Ring hasn't gotten its DLC, which is inevitable. Dark Souls 1 and 2 also benefited from that greatly. I'm mostly mentioning these last two because a lot of people know those games for the major bosses. But when you think about it, a lot of the major highlights are in DLC. In all honesty though, either way, Sekiro beat all of these games anyway and didn't even need DLC. But that game was very focused on bosses too. And speaking of which, I've always been a proponent that the bosses shouldn't be the focus of these games, or even the thing that they're best at. I think they're best at compact area level design and exploration, as I've constantly been praising them with their legacy dungeons in Elden Ring, and even in Dark Souls, where the exploration was painfully linear. Some of the individual levels can sometimes still be really good. Cathedral of the Deep comes to mind, for instance. As already mentioned, I do think From Software has the potential to do some really cool and unique gimmick bosses. Demon's Souls had plenty, although in my opinion they kind of faltered with these kinds of bosses for a long time, I'd say until Sekiro. Screen Monkeys and especially Divine Dragon were really good in a sort of return to form. Kind of unexpectedly, given that it's supposed to be a more combat-oriented game. Say what you will about Demon's Souls and its simplistic bosses, but the more complicated a boss is, the more there is to scrutinize and the more you can get wrong. I feel like this is partly the reason why I sometimes had harder time placing Elden Ring bosses in a tier confidently. After looking at the objective strengths and flaws of a boss, I have to subjectively decide whether the issues are outweighed by the strengths or things like the atmosphere of a boss. To me, From Software games have always been about the sum of their parts, rather than about the combat or the boss fights, which is why I personally always take a moment to appreciate all aspects of it, whether it be the PvE, the PvP, bosses, the area design, the atmosphere of things. I've even dabbled a little bit with speedruns and no-hit runs, even if those things aren't really intended gameplay. I think all these things together will make a From Software game what it is. And admittedly, a lot of the newer titles have been missing that part of their strengths because a lot of people have been focusing more on the combat and on the bosses. It's what most people talk about generally when these games are brought up. That and the difficulty, which can also be kind of contentious. And I don't even mean it in the easy mode kind of discussion, I mean it more so in how the game is balanced. Which kind of ties back to what I was talking about earlier with how a lot of bosses have been added a couple of aspects that make them harder. And it feels like they're just doing it to make it harder for like the experienced crowd. Because, you know, people get really good at these games when they play them for 5-10 years. And I just generally think that's a misplaced priority, as I mentioned earlier. You've been seeing some call footage in the background, so let's take a moment to discuss that in these games. I feel like any veteran Souls player knows this story by heart. It is a very commonly spread one, but if you haven't heard it, it's a very interesting one. Miyazaki came up with the mechanics for this kind of random co-op help from an experience he had, where him and a bunch of people were stuck in a snowstorm trying to get over a hill that was pretty hard to get by because of the snow. Now we're talking about a chain here. I assume this is a very busy road that they had to go through. But eventually, they came up with a system where the person who was about to get over the hill would have the person behind them help them push over the hill. And then once they got over, the person that was helping would get in their car and the person behind them would help them push over the hill. And that experience of having a stranger help you out to get through something stuck with it so much that he kind of implemented to this gameplay. If you think about it, a person who had a really good experience with someone helping them out through a tough boss might be likely to want to help another person get through that boss themselves. So this is kind of how the co-op cycle happened, especially in the early games, where you just call out a stranger, they would help you out, and then you'll be more likely to help someone out because you feel like you want to return the favor. Now, friendly reminder that a lot of the early games didn't have a password system, so you couldn't reliably summon friends that you know to play, and it was mostly just strangers that would help you. These days, of course, you can summon friends pretty reliably, which I don't think is necessarily a bad change by any means, but it's certainly one of those really inspired mechanics that, well, it's very unique to these games. It is a very immersive way to get people through these games that are notoriously very, very hard. And it's a friendly reminder that we're all in this together, you know? And with that said, there's not really much wrong with the multiplayer in these games. The one thing I'll say about co-op specifically in Elden Ring is that at first the options are very confusing. There's a lot of items that kind of have the same purpose, especially in the release until they got changed. So sometimes it can just be really bewildering how to summon a friend or something. I know my first experience was really weird, and for like 10 minutes we couldn't figure out if we were doing anything right until the sign finally popped up. But in general, it's fine. Of course, as mentioned, now you can summon anyone you want for as long as you can, and it's more accessible than ever. Now, that Kid Story inspired co-op, I don't want to know what inspired Invasions whatsoever. Of course, we're going to talk about Invasions proper now, meaning that my build is actually complete. It is level 168. This number is to ideally invade New Game Plus and not be hitting a lot of fog gates. So for instance, the fog gate to Radahn and such. The stats will be on the right. The physic mix I'm using is the one that gives you nearly infinite poise and elemental damage absorption for 10 seconds, so I can trade with people. It uses beast incantations along with the Black Blade, and the weapons are Axe of Godfrey and Maliketh's Black Blade. Wonder who guessed the build correctly. Let's set something straight right away. And let's be real about this. Invasions in this game are a balancing mechanic. You can hold whatever opinion you want about invasions as a mechanic or invaders as people, but get real with me for a second and acknowledge that co-op can potentially make this game piss easy. And so invasions, especially in these later games, I'm not going to necessarily defend the early games where you can invade solo hosts. I never personally liked that too much. But at least in this game, it's supposed to be intended as a balancing mechanic, and I mean, it's fairly good. But you have to acknowledge that even if you had a bad experience with an invader, generally speaking, it's 2v1 or even 3v1, and even if the invader used enemies to get an advantage, that's still to mostly even the odds. At the end of the day, invaders just want to have fun, just like you and your friends are. Some people might have a more twisted version of what fun can be to them, but not only does that not apply to all invaders, some summons and their hosts can also have a twisted idea of fun. Invaders can be bullies, hosts and their summons can be bullies. Everything clear? I hope so. I don't necessarily want to start an invasion war in the comments, but I am willing to have a discussion with y'all if you keep it respectful. Anyway, to me personally, this is my favorite PvP since Bloodborne, but it does have some pretty terrible issues. For instance, sometimes when you spawn into a world, one of the 2 or 3 players can be invisible, which can be really bad if you are especially in a 3v1 and you just can't see one of the players. It's terrible. I don't think that's happened as frequently as it has in the previous game. It was like once in a blue moon kind of thing. Getting hit can sometimes shift your hitbox, meaning that if you trade, sometimes your weapon will just swing away. And while sure that can be cool when it happens to you, as an invader when you're trying to do that, you generally want to have a calculated trade, and if it doesn't even go through, then it was a waste of time and you just took damage and probably died. Overlevel phantoms are not very properly nerfed ever, which has been a problem for a few games now, but it feels particularly bad in this one, given how strong the weapons can be in general. But even worse than that, they don't have an indicator when it's an overlevel phantom. Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 both did, and this game doesn't. And lastly, the Phantom Bloody Finger is currently bugged, and whenever you use it, those said overlevel phantoms will actually have their nerf removed, meaning that they'll do normal damage on the players. The Bloody Finger is actually a really good tool to use, but this kind of just makes it a nonsense use, unless if they don't have phantoms and they only have hunters, for instance, so you already kill the phantoms, and it's really bad. I suspect this might have been a recent issue because recently, FromSoft finally decided to kind of split PvE versus PvP damage with players. Because I don't think using the Bloody Finger would just nerf the phantoms in PvE as well. That wouldn't make sense. It could be the case, but I don't think it would be. Okay, with all my ranting, I can tell I have more problems than I realized. But I still really enjoy it for the most part. It's just one of those little, small, aching annoyances that can really ruin an invasion sometimes. And given that invaders generally have to play nearly perfectly to win an invasion, and sometimes even when you do, you still can't lose pretty easy, it just adds up over time. And I do want to comment, the reason I say Bloodborne and this game are my favorites so far is that I think the combat in general is some of the best in this one. And as a result, it kind of just goes well with PvP. At least invasions. Duels, I don't really duels. They can be fun once in a while, but I don't like to duel too much. Now moving on from that, I do want to mention that I do miss the 6-player multiplayer. Right now it's capped at 4 people, unless you're in the Colosseum. And I want to say they made this choice consciously because of the bigger open world. They knew it was probably going to be a lot more taxing on people's systems and stuff. So they probably made a call early on, or maybe after testing it, that they probably should limit it to 4 people. But I do think it could have been nice if maybe in the smaller areas that are more sealed and you can't really traverse through the open world too much, or at all, that they should have had 3v3 invasions being possible. Or even 4v2, I don't really care, I just like having a fellow invader with me, it's really fun. If you're unaware how it worked in Dark Souls 3 for instance, and these set special areas for PvP, where you could have 2 summons, the host, and then 3 invaders total. So that means it could be like just a 3v3 full-on combat, kind of like in the Colosseum in Elden Ring. Now even Bloodborne didn't have this system. It was like almost impossible to get a second invader in any situation, which is kind of annoying because those are the 2 that I like the most, and you can't have a fellow invader, which is really fun to me. And I definitely miss that. As I mentioned earlier, I do think it was a missed opportunity for, say, Mohgwyn Palace to not be a special PvP zone, where you can at least have a fellow invader there. Now let's discuss Hunters, the blue phantoms, and why they're fucking obnoxious. To be able to invade in this game, the host has to have at least 1 phantom already in the world. This means that if a hunter is summoned, they are never gonna be helping a solo host. Because for them to have already been summoned, they have to already have a phantom in, be invaded, and so you are coming in as a second phantom, or the invader killed their phantom, and you just went ahead and replaced that phantom immediately, most likely. And the same thing can happen if there's already 2 phantoms in the world. The host could have had 2 phantoms, invader killed 1 or died to PvE or whatever, and then you replace that phantom, which means that you are basically just coming in to help gank the invader. The only exception is when a player has activated the Taunter's Tongue, which allows them to be invaded without a phantom in the world, or it opens up to a 2v2 if you can summon one phantom or one hunter. But even then, sometimes it can still be open to 3 if no second invader comes in fast enough. But in my experience, that's only about 1 to 5% of players or so playing the game. And usually they are PvPers themselves. That is not a bad use for the hunters if there's a second invader in the world. So in Dark Souls 2 and 3, these blues kind of acted as police or as a hero, because you could be invaded solo, meaning that you can be invaded, and if you're a solo host that's not used to PvP and want help, you could put on the Way of Blue or whatever it's called, and then you would have a blue phantom show up to try and help them. That is fine. Personally, as someone who prefers fighting 2 or 3 people at once rather than 1v1s, especially a solo host who doesn't know what they're doing, I prefer that in those games. But in this game, you are not the hero, you are not the police, you're just helping to shred apart invaders. Now that's assuming they're even good. Like, listen, don't get me wrong, I love my free flash recharge that these hunters are, because often they're not even that good. I don't think people realize that they're no longer police or whatever. They're just kind of helping gank the invader. And if you want to do that, so be it. I know a lot of us don't mind the challenge, especially we're still doing the invasions at this point in the game. But that's why I think that the hunter system in general is not as good as FromSoft probably thought it was going to be. I would say it should be more used whenever a world is Hunter's Tongue, like it should have priority. And it could have, but so little people do it that, you know, it's not going to be a very common thing that happens. So yeah, that's my experience as an invader in this game. Hope if anyone is watching that isn't familiar with invasions, or maybe dislikes them because of bad experiences they've had, hope you can at least see the perspective from our side and understand that, you know, we don't have to be as bad as you make us out to be. Now to sort of piggyback off of that discussion, and we have mentioned this a couple times, let's now talk about the Colosseum that was added a little more recently. Now for these, I actually did them at level 125, which is a common meta for pretty much all the games. So this was earlier than the divisions I did. My build wasn't quite complete, but I did just go in there a little early. I really like that the Colosseum exists, as it's a no-risk method for people to try out the PvP in this game. Because a lot of people are terrified by even trying PvP because, you know, you only get one chance, one life, and it can be a lot more punishing as a result. So this is an easier way to ease into it. A bad experience even here can potentially turn off people from PvP entirely, but I do hope that there's people who have tried this out and decided to actually engage in the invasion mechanic, for instance. Mind you, invading is a whole different ballgame than a simple 1v1 or even 3v3. It's often outnumbered in your opponent's favor, but I will tell you, the first time you take down a group of 2 players, and especially 3 in invasion, ooh, man, you can become addicted to that feeling, especially if you do it with a fun build you came up with and didn't look up on YouTube. But that's just me. Anyway, this is turned to invasion propaganda, so let's back up a bit to Colosseum again. I mean, yeah, it can be some quite dumb fun. Grab a friend or 2, plan builds that synergize with each other, and you can lose a few hours, I imagine. This was definitely popping off when it first launched, as you'd expect. I could even hop on in some of my low-level characters that intentionally stop upgrading weapons for matchmaking purposes, and still get a ton of matches back-to-back. These days, you might not be so lucky unless if it's a really popular range, so you might want to stick to any level that's likely a 25 plus weapon range, which can be anywhere from level, say, 10 to 200. 125 being an old school level meta for the other games, and some still adopt that. 150 being another popular one, etc. But yeah, I don't got too much else to say. I prefer invading because it's a much more immersive experience, but call-out can be fun from time to time. Try it out. But yeah, let's finish this baby. On to the end game. As Tudor has witnessed, I have interesting thoughts about this boss. This boss can sometimes have 2 layers of delays, one from him holding his attack back for a long period of time, and the second one from his AoE, which has its own delay as well. You can't only dodge the weapon hitting the floor, for instance. You have to delay that a little bit. Also finding very annoyingly aggressive in phase 2, finding places to heal is very rare, and his instant transmission followed by different attacks is very, very extra as well. Because I've noticed 2 or 3 different attacks it can do, so you can't just roll the transmission and then roll again. You have to kind of see what he does, but you barely have enough time to react to it. All these annoyances mostly outweigh any fun I could have, leading me to have to rate this pretty low, at a C. Now I can't see how this aggressive boss could be fun for people, so maybe it'll be a fight I learn and enjoy better as I get better for rune number 1. But at the moment, I just don't like it. I haven't liked it since release. I have gotten somewhat better at it, but a lot of the time it's kind of like Malenia, where I just kind of try to stagger him as much as possible, or I'll DPS him doing a lot of weird shenanigans. So doing a low damage run will actually be quite a teaching tool. I did do the Bonley run, but that one is very different. And so now for Elden Beast. When I first played the game, the Elden Stars did annoy me beyond belief, but as you kind of start understanding how this attack works, vaguely at least, and potentially some nerfs with some patches, I don't know if that's actually a thing, but it kind of feels like it got nerfed over time. But either way, it definitely feels more manageable. In low damage runs, it can still be pretty bad, especially if he decides to recast it. But people have figured out methods to skip it or survive it plenty by this point. Outside of that, yes, the fact that you can be caught in an AI loop or he just keeps diving away from you is annoying, but it's not nearly as bad as Fire Giant, which causes damage as well when he tries to get away from you. But for me, the rest of the fight is perfectly fair, and I prefer the spectacle of this fight versus all the crap Radagon has going on. And this segment of the song is just much better to me as well. A tier, burn me at the stake, I know some of y'all will, but this is just Little Birdo's opinion. For myself, it took me a few months to fully accept how I feel about this game. If I can avoid it, or if I don't have a strong impression at first, I try to let things sit with me so I can decide how I feel about things. To give you some context, this is how my general ranking of the FromSoft games go. Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, and Sekiro are all S tiers for me. Dark Souls 3 is 2 tiers below that, and Dark Souls 1 is 1 tier below Dark Souls 3. After I played Elden Ring a couple times after the first month or two, I think I decided that it's squarely an A tier, in between Dark Souls 3 and all the other S tiers, filling in that gap. Dark Souls 3 has enjoyable bosses, but every time I have to get through areas like Undead Settlement, Farum Keep, Irithyll, etc., I audibly groan and wonder why I'm putting myself through this in the first place. I just don't enjoy running through those areas at all, casually or, speedily. Like I mentioned earlier, Liurnia and Mountaintops give me a similar feeling, but I haven't had those areas grind my gears nearly as much, and I've played Elden Ring casually upwards of 20 times, and Dark Souls 3 maybe around 15 to 20. All this to say, I enjoy playing Elden Ring more than Dark Souls 3, but not nearly as much as the perfect tier games on my ranking. However, I would say that it's still a bit disappointing. Perhaps this is on me for having this expectation, but I expected Elden Ring to be a culmination of all the best aspects of all the From Software games thus far, where they learn from their experience and failures and bring it all together for this huge experience. While it certainly succeeded in some regards, it fails miserably in others for a company that has been making these games for over 10 years. There's something to be said for the design by committee approach versus the singular version of one man or a small group of people. It definitely feels like it has affected the games in the more recent years, but thankfully they haven't fallen nearly as hard as other companies have by homogenizing. I mean, as I mentioned, Sekiro is an S tier game for me, so even if it is designed by committee, it's still doing pretty good at it. A lot of people think this game would have improved massively if it was smaller overall, or if it was not an open world and more of a tight and compact game. As much as I love open world games and exploring them, Breath of the Wild being my favorite game of all time, it's still hard not to agree that some of the issues of this game certainly could have been mitigated a bit by it approaching it closer to the older games. However, I do fear this could lead into a game like Dark Souls 3, which I was even more disappointed by than this game. Though part of the reason is because it was the forced sequel of a series that probably shouldn't have gone past the first game. However, there's financially no way that FromSoft isn't working on a DLC at the moment, so this isn't where the game's lifespan ends either. And if it hasn't already, it'll likely be announced in the near future. I think everybody and their mother is confident that Miquella will be a big focus in at least one of the DLCs, if there is more than one. Some obvious examples are the cocoon behind Mohg that just smells of a warp point into Miquella's dream world or something of the sort. It's a potential Great Ruin reward that we'd never get in the base game. He's an incredibly significant figure in the lore, with great influence in the world. And there's cut content that implies that there was an intention of an entirely different ending for following a Miquella-tied questline. Whatever the case, and whatever the content is that we play, every single game's DLC has been among the best content of each game, and also has some of the best and most memorable boss fights. So I'm not worried in that regard. I'm ready to be surprised. What I do want to do is make a little wish list for things I hope we get added. So, here are some things I would like to see in the Elden Ring DLC. A catalyst that can cast both sorceries and incantations. Demon Souls had the Talisman of Beasts, Dark Souls 2 had Black Witch's Staff, and Dark Souls 3 has the White Hair Talisman and the Crystal Chime, so it wouldn't be unprecedented. I don't care if it has the worst scaling of any cast tool, within reason anyway, it's just too useful to not have one. More Ice Lightning incantations or weapons. I know the incantations fall under the Dragon Cult school, so it's not simply a lonely spell, but it's a very cool concept that should see more use. An Ash of War might also be acceptable, if it's viable enough. At least one area that allows 3v3 invasions. This could be a smaller, more compact area if performance was a factor for them cutting down the number of players, something like the Mohgwyn Palace for instance, which definitely should have been a Covenant-based PvP area to begin with. Honorable mention to a miracle like Anti-Magic Field and Vow of Silence to shut down spellcasters for a brief while. I could live without it, but how fun would it be if you could shut down 3 wizard players and see them scramble around in panic? Would be extra spicy if it can shut down ranged Ashes of War too, but that could be overkill. And that is the end of the video. Please tell me how the game holds up for you after the recency bias has worn off, or you can even share what your wishlist for the DLC looks like. I was originally going to make this a little more of a standard review of the game overall, rather than how I feel it holds up compared to the initial impression, but if I were to do that, I would like to review the whole package with DLC, so perhaps expect an even more thorough review of the game one day once it is complete, and once all the content has sunk in. Anyway, this has been a ton of work, so I appreciate if you got all the way to the end. This was a 33-page script. And even though I've done scripts before and some long format videos, this is definitely the most work I had to put on a script alone. And it was definitely a killer in its own way. If you happen to be new to the channel, right now I'm in the middle of a series where I explore the 1.0 version of Elden Ring and document a lot of the major changes I find. Also like to make videos on callbacks that Elden Ring does to the previous FromSoft games. I've done one for Demon's Souls and Bloodborne, and actually want to work on those a little bit more. Thinking of doing Sekiro next, because Dark Souls I would like to do all 3 at once. Also do PvP build showcases videos where I invade and just show a bunch of really funny or good clips. Those are mostly for me, but I enjoy making them. So yeah, if anything like that sounds up your alley, consider subscribing. I'm looking forward to DLC just as much as anybody, and we'll certainly be making content on it when it comes out. So I hope to see you then. But for now, thanks for watching. Hope to see you around. Bye bye.